Okay, good morning. I'm going to open the meeting. Patty, could you please call the roll?
Commissioner Snyder,
Present.
Commissioner Galpin,
Present.
Commissioner Wallen-Daly.
Here.
So I guess.
Yeah, and today I think we just have a presentation from DLCD.
We have Josh Lombard here
Excellent. Hi,
Today
Josh.
to give us a, were you at the presentation last year? No.
2 years ago? Yeah.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you all haven't met Josh. This is Josh Lombard. He's our DLCD representative here in Southern Oregon.
Uh-oh, not Southern California.
Wow.
Sorry.
Whew, it's
I have
a
the
way
wrong
to
meeting.
start a meeting.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Josh Lombard. I work for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'm the Southern Oregon rep for the department. So I cover Jackson County, Josephine County, Douglas, and I've just recently taken over Klamath and Lake counties from my counterpart. So pretty big region, but I've been with DLCD for about 15 years now. Before that, I worked for the county for a little stint, and then did some... For Jackson County, yep. I worked for Jackson County, and before that I did a little time in California, not Southern California.
I've never
Central
lived down
California.
there. I swear, I've never
Central
been.
California, and
It is.
so I worked in California, so I have a little bit of a different experience down there, and then I'm from the Midwest and did some work out there doing land use planning and college there. So anyway, just bringing a little bit of a multi-state perspective to Oregon, because Oregon does have a very unique system here. So I think it's important to kind of bring some outside experience to be able to honestly evaluate like how the system's doing. So the training today is just, we call it land use decision making. It's really geared, and we mostly do it for planning commissioners, but in small cities we will often do it for the city council, sometimes for the board of commissioners. But planning commissioners is really who this is geared towards, because it's you all that are interfacing on the land use issues first and foremost. That's really what you guys do. Whereas the board or the city councils, they dabble in it a little bit, but they've got a lot bigger purview of what they're doing. So this is just kind of a run through, and really this is meant to be kind of an open conversation, really informal. So stop me anytime you have a question. If it's, I'm going to get to it later in the presentation, I'll let you know. But and if I like fly over something too fast, ask some clarifying questions or whatever. But I don't want to spend too much time talking at you. If you have questions, feel free. So I'm going to start out kind of general. Most of you probably all know this, but the land use planning program has been in place for over 50 years. In 1973, Senate Bill 100 was passed by a Republican governor, and it had bipartisan support at the legislature at that time. Senate Bill 100 created our commission, the commission that oversees my department, which is the Land Conservation and Development Commission, LCDC, and created my department, which is the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD. And I put those acronyms up there because often they're interchanged, because it couldn't be more confusing, probably, LCDC and DLCD, but just to let you know what those two things refer to. So, like I said, Senate Bill 100, directed, or established LCDC, our commission, and my department. It also directed the commission to establish new statewide planning goals and guidelines for land use planning for the state. So I put this up here just to illustrate the fact that there was a ton of outreach that happened during that process. There was over 100, they sent out over 100,000 questionnaires to citizens, residents of the state, and over 10,000 people participated in multiple, hearings and meetings across the state to develop these. So it was one of those things that garnered a lot of interest, and there was a lot of public participation in that. And then the last piece I put on this slide is just to also let people know that there was a complementary bill that passed with Senate Bill 100, and that was Senate Bill 101, which really established the special assessment program for farm and forest property owners. Because as you all know, what one of the things that Senate Bill 100 did, well, not exactly when Senate Bill 100 happened, but when the land use legislation actually came to be, is the uses and the lot sizes changed on farm and forest parcels, restricting people's use and what they could do on that. Senate Bill 100, what that was doing is kind of proactively saying, hey, we understand there's going to be some reduction in value. We're going to give you a reduction in your property tax assessments to kind of compensate for that. So there are 19 statewide planning goals that were created during that entire process, and that took quite a while to develop the goals. So there's 19 of them. There's only 14 that apply. Not only. There's 14 that apply in the inland areas. In this inland area, there's one that's particular to the Willamette River Greenway, and then there's 4 that are really only apply on the coast. And I'll get into just a few of these, and once again, stop me if you have questions. Come and try to kind of keep it high level. So the first 2 goals are what we kind of consider our process goals. So goal 1 is citizen involvement, and really the goal is to just develop a program that involves people. And you guys interface with that all the time. You Jackson County actually do represent the citizen involvement, piece to the puzzle, right? Jackson County doesn't any longer have its own citizen involvement committee, right? You used to. Actually was a liaison when I worked here for that. It's a tough thing to run, because they're not, basically when people sign up for like what you do, they want to make decisions, and when folks realize they're on the citizen involvement committee and all they were doing is really kind of talking about how to educate people. I mean, there's something important about that, but it was missing the bigger component that attracted people. So that went away, but you guys all represent, the goal 1 for Jackson County. And we'll get into some more of the details on that. And then goal 2 is just our land use planning goal, which is really just to ensure that cities and counties have processes in place, a framework for informed decision making. So that's having adequate factual base in your codes and in your comprehensive plans and the policy framework to support your decision making. And then the goals that you all as county planning commissioners interface with a lot are what we call our rural goals. So goal 3, which is real simple, to preserve and maintain agricultural land. Goal 4 is a little bit more complicated. Basically, it's to preserve forest land, but not just for forest productivity. That's one of the pieces in here, but as you can see in here, forest land has other, values, environmental values as far as air, water, quality, those kind of things. And then also recreational opportunities, that a lot of those opportunities happen on forest land. This slide I just throw up here just to kind of give folks an indication of how well the program's working, and the numbers don't really matter exactly, just to say that the amount of farmland conversion that happened since the land use planning program has come into existence is a lot substantially less than what it was before then. The farmland conversion was one of the main factors as to what moved the legislature and the governor to create the program. So as you all know, we have very strong farm and forest land protections built into the statewide planning program. And that last bullet point, compared to other states near us, we're doing quite well, even on the West Coast, which has, some of the most aggressive kind of land use planning programs in the country. We got a bunch of urban goals that we don't need to necessarily get into. I get into them a little bit more when I interface with cities, especially small cities. But we've got a bunch of them that span from urbanization to housing to economic development, public services or public facilities. You guys all interface with that one a little bit when folks come in, especially to apply for Goal 11 exceptions, when they want to hook up to sewer service. Goal 12, actually, you interface with a bit too. With transportation, your transportation system plan. And then goal 8 is recreation. And then we have what we call our constraints goals. So goal 5 is like our natural resources stuff. So you think about like wetlands, open space kind of stuff. And then goal 7 is our natural hazards. And you all interface with those quite a bit. It's built into your plans, especially with wildfire and things like that. Steep slopes. It's just getting into the responsibilities of land use planning in the state. You know, we do have a statewide program. It's different than other states that, you know, especially states that don't. So I just wanted to kind of, you know, carve out the differences. So our commission, so the Land Conservation Development Commission, they adopt land use policies and the goals, and they developed the goals originally. We haven't touched them in a long time, but they do make rule changes fairly often. Rule changes, and we can get into this later too, but rule changes happen either it's something that's initiated by the department, by the governor, or by legislation. So the legislature, you know, creates statute, and each legislative session there's some type of land use statute that comes out that changes the foundation, the laws for land use. They're not always written with the level of specificity that's needed to implement those, and often that's deliberate. Sometimes that's not deliberate. So our commission is then tasked with you know, creating that specificity to be able to implement that legislation. The commission does also hold hearings for enforcement of the goals, rules, and statutes. We have what's called the citizen-initiated enforcement process. So we hear, actually right now, we're hearing quite a few cases right now. So it's somebody that, it has to meet certain criteria, but somebody that's basically making a case to the state that a county or a city isn't upholding its, you know, its share of their agreement to implement statewide planning goals. So it needs to be more than they're not happy with a subdivision in their backyard. That's the kind of stuff that you all hear about, and especially the planning department hears about. It needs to be something that's a little bit bigger of a statewide significance. But there's a few of those happening right now. So they hold hearings to do that. And then they also make decisions on like the bigger picture kind of things like urban growth boundary amendments or periodic review proposals. We don't need to necessarily get into the details on that, but there's certain things that elevate to the level that requires their attention.
That board, is that an appointed board?
It is. It's appointed by the governor. Yeah.
Okay, and
Yeah.
all members on that are appointed by the governor?
That's right, yeah. And they have to have the same, similar to planning commissions or boards, you know, they have to have, there's a certain amount of representation they need. It's geographic representation, so somebody representing different parts of the state and then different interests. Yeah. So our department, as opposed to our commission, you know, we are the ones that are often doing the writing of those land use policies. So we, you know, our commission isn't, you know, rolling up their sleeves and actually doing that work. They're the ones that are making the decisions, just like you all are to staff. So we're the ones in the department that are making that are writing the rule changes or proposals, and we're the ones that are like holding all the public meetings or like. We put together rules advisory committees, you know, a variety of folks, you know, sometimes they're really big, but variety of different interests depending on the topic, and going around the state, holding meetings, soliciting input and writing those things. So we're doing the work that leads up to the decision making on that. And then we also help enforce the goals, rules, and statutes. So the way that we do this is, you know, I'm working closely with planning directors, the planning departments, both at the county and the city in my region to help them through sticky situations or like, you know, hot topic kind of stuff. But then we also, and I put our divisions on there on the left. I'm part of the community services division, so it's like the regional reps like myself, there's 9 of us around the state, but we also have specialists like a farm and forest specialist and an economic development specialist that help provide input to the planning departments that we work with. We've got a housing division, coastal management, planning services, which does like natural hazards. But our newest one, and the reason why I'm highlighting this now is because the newest one is HAPO, which is basically like our housing accountability and production office. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but that's a new kind of arm to a new division, a new arm for us. And they're really set up they're not an enforcement agency per se, but they are set up to do that level of work, which we really didn't have before. So we are more responsive to complaints from citizens, from developers, even from cities that, or answering questions. We basically got a form on our website that people can submit. So if it's a developer and they're not happy with what a certain city is doing or how they're processing something, or they're taking such a long time, or there's interpretation that they don't like, they can submit that to us as a complaint, and then we will, by law, have to review that and make a determination as to how we feel about that. So basically, we're providing our input, which we've always done, but it's a bit more formal now, and anyway, it can trigger more type of levels of enforcement if there isn't agreement with that. So just letting you guys know that there's a new kind of division amongst our department that is more like directly related or directly tied to the development community and the housing, advocate community. And then the last one, I don't need to go down this list, but the last one I want to just talk about is providing the technical assistance and grant funding. I put that up there because when I started 15 years ago, we basically had one grant program, which was our general technical assistance grant program, and we had, I think, under $1 million in that program. Because of the housing affordability issue and a variety of other issues that have kind of raised some attention for our department, we have a lot more money to be able to provide to communities these days, especially for housing matters, but for other things as well. So we have a much more robust grant program. So that's a big piece of what I do and what we do as a department now is administer grants. So, and it's a nice kind of change a little bit to my department instead of always being in that role where interfacing with folks on hot topic things, and it's always sensitive. Now we're actually being able to give money out to communities and be part of that grant process to be able to update their codes or to update a comprehensive plan or something like that to address things that they've been wanting to address for a really long time.
I had a question on the Housing Accountability Office. How does that fit in with other, let's say you receive a complaint and HAPO looks at it. What happened? Is their word final, or does it go to an appeals process? How does that all work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I have to admit, I don't know all the details because it's fairly new in my region. We haven't had to advance it too far, but the way it works is there's two levels of how they can submit something. One is just hey, can you guys chime in on this kind of thing, a little bit more informal, and then another one is a formal complaint. So the ones that we've received down in this region, it's usually, it always has been in that less formal category. So what that does is it triggers a response from our department. The response goes back to whoever submitted that, but we also then CC or copy the planning department, whatever, if it's the city or the county on that, so that they're in the know. And usually that triggers some more conversation, between us and the property owner or the developer, whoever submitted that, and then the city or the county. So up until now, my understanding is that it's always been resolved that way. If it is something that isn't resolved, we do have a formal process, and there is I believe a hearings officer, but I have to get back to you because I don't really know the details yet on how that would work out. But there is more of a process to especially if a city is consistently making decisions that are against what our opinion is, then it's something that even rises a little bit further up, because it's affecting more people, and then it might be of statewide significance or at least regional significance. Yeah.
Josh, when it came out, planning was told that they really want to provide us with assistance as opposed to enforcement action. So they would come in and guide us and tell us what we think they should do, or whatever the case is. That was kind of more of the whole process rather than just to come in and say, yeah, you got to do it this way. That's
Yeah, oh no, totally. I mean, just to back up a little bit, our department still has this legacy of when we rolled out the statewide planning program in the late 1970s and 80s, that it was super heavy-handed, and we basically forced the hand of all these communities to develop these comprehensive plans and land development codes. So we still carry that with us, this kind of like bad rap, so to speak, with us. And I think, this new division, if we didn't roll that out correctly, would be working basically towards that, towards kind of continuing that ill will, so to speak, So we're doing our best to roll it out in a nice, soft manner. And we've always, as a department, we really want to try to work through these things, in a very communicative way, in a collaborative way, and not force anything down anybody's throat. At the same time, there are rules and laws that we need to administer, as you guys all know. So, but we try to do it with as much tact as possible. So you guys know this stuff. This slideshow, I just want to let you know, is designed for all communities. Some communities I go to do this to are, they see 1 or 2 land use decisions a year at best. So I'll kind of just generalize this stuff. But you guys know the city and the county. You want to address your local visions and your needs. Adopt. You can help participate in adopting and amending comprehensive plan zoning codes, and then you also enforce the codes. Through a variety of means. And then the biggest thing that we'll talk about today is that you all make land use decisions. That's what you do on a regular basis. I don't really need to go over this too much, but maybe just a little bit to explain that, what I said earlier. There's statute, the Oregon revised statute, which comes out of the legislature, and then you've got the statewide planning goals, which came out of our commission early on. Those both lead into the administrative rules, which are created by our department, by our commission, and then those feed down to local comprehensive plans, and then local ordinances which implement comprehensive plans, and then that leads to local decisions. And you guys all know this. I don't really need to get into detail here. The only thing that I highlight on this one is that there's a little dash line that's going between planning commission and city staff. Basically, that's just acknowledging that you guys are not supervisory. You don't supervise staff. You have this interesting relationship with staff, but you don't supervise them. You guys all know that. So what are the responsibilities of the planning commission? So one is you want to reflect community values. You want to make recommendations, recommend policies to your county commissioners. You want to participate in your visioning, long-range planning. You want to also educate the public and provide a public forum. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And then once again, you all make land use decisions. What's important, to understand, as far as your relationship with your electeds, you have to understand your responsibilities and authority. You guys, like I said earlier, you guys focus on land use issues. That's what your job is. The board dabbles in it, especially they're touching appeals and they're touching the bigger things that need to come to them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But that's your purview, that's your focus, right? So just knowing that you are the land use experts, when it comes to land use decisions. So with that, you want to make sound recommendations. If you're not making a decision at the local level or at your level, you want to make sure your recommendation to the board is sound and that you have findings, substantial findings and clear reasoning. And we'll go into some detail on that in a little bit. And then the last piece is don't be afraid to give their governing body, so your board, advice on planning matters. That's really your job. Like I said, you are the experts. They dabble in this stuff, and they're hearing from a lot of people about land use issues, but you are the experts when it comes to land use. So what's your relationship to staff? Well, as I said earlier, you don't supervise them, right? Should be looking at staff as a resource, work as a team, and I think you guys have a good relationship here with staff. Not all communities are like that. There are some communities where planning commission or city council or board have kind of an adversarial relationship, and it's really awkward. It's not something we'd advise. We strongly advise against that. So look at them, as a resource, as a team, right? You also want to respect that staff have competing priorities and professional responsibilities when they bring something forward to you. So they may bring something forward to you that you disagree with, as far as a recommendation. They're going to have some reasoning for bringing that forward in the way they did, right? So just, having that level of respect and understanding that there's other things going on. Recognizing that planning commission's a conduit for the public to staff. So some people do come into the front counter, but it's usually when they want to ask a question about their particular property. The front counter isn't really the venue for them to just come and chat with staff about the land use planning program or what Jackson County is thinking about these things. That's not how, at least is how I've known in the past, how you guys staff your front counter. So this is really the conduit, for the public to be able to interface with staff and to learn about the planning program and ask questions. So anyway, we'll get into this a little bit in detail, but just make sure you're welcoming and open when it comes to inviting people to come and talk about things. What's your relationship to the public? I just kind of alluded to that. The golden rule is to be fair. Not all situations are going to be positive situations when the public comes in, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. But your job is to be fair, to treat everybody the same, to give everybody the same amount of time to speak, right? And to be open, right? To not cringe when somebody says something, to try to, you want, even if you disagree, you don't want to be fair about it. You also want to follow open meeting law, which I know you guys at the county, you get a script, right, and stuff, and you guys are very well versed in this. Like I said, some communities I work with are not as well versed. Do your homework. It's very obvious as staff when you come and present whether the commission has actually read through the material or not. It's important to do your homework. That doesn't mean you have to read through every single page. Kristen's probably going to disagree with this, but you can. There are some things you can maybe gloss over, but do your homework. Come in informed, right? You want to conduct your quasi-judicial hearings, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail later according to the required rules. Be respectful to everybody. This is important, when it comes to hearings, especially that get a little bit more controversial. Is don't digress. Don't allow something that someone's brought up to let you as a planning commission stray off course for too long, right? Holding a planning commission meeting, and same with the board, it's like this delicate balance of being efficient but also being thorough, right? So you don't want to just blow off somebody's comment, but if it is something that's going to take you off in a different direction and is not addressing the criteria or whatever that need to be addressed, you can state that and kind of move on instead of indulging that conversation for too long. Stressful situations, we're all going to have it. Land use is a reason I like land use. It's there's a lot of very passionate people. There's a lot of energy and passion when it comes to thinking about what people can and can't do on their property or in their town, right? So there's going to be some stressful situations, right? So these are just some tips to how to respond to that. For legislative decisions, and we'll get into that later, especially, you can adjourn the meeting. Things get too heated, you can literally just adjourn the meeting. A legislative decision, you're not required to make a decision, so you can just hit the pause button and say, well, we're going to reconvene in 2 weeks or, whatever, a month, whenever you're going to hold the next hearing. For quasi-judicial decisions where there is a time frame, you can end the the in-person public meeting and just reconvene online. And I know you guys, there's a requirement now since 2022 to be able to have the online version, so you have that going right now. So you could always end the in-person public meeting and reconvene online. Or you can, if there is enough time built in with, and we'll get into some time frames on quasi-judicial decisions, but if there's enough time, you can just postpone it to the next meeting as well. Touched on this earlier, don't descend to the level of vitriol. So if if there's anger, it's usually not directed towards you. I mean, it's hard sometimes to not take it personally, but it's usually not directed toward you. It's about the process or about this particular application. So it's really, you need to stay above that kind of stuff as planning commission. You guys get this, but it doesn't hurt to remind folks about that. And don't be intimidated in your decision making. Your goal, your job is to make decisions, and especially for quasi judicial decisions, you have to make decisions. So yeah, don't let the vitriol, the anger persuade you otherwise. All right, so let's get into some kind of tools. First is your comprehensive plan. So comprehensive plans are often overlooked. They're usually beefy. They're made up of multiple chapters, multiple elements or chapters, depending on what folks call them. And they often are pretty old. But if you read through those, you can tell they were developed with a lot of outreach, and there's a lot of really good input in there. Some of it's stale. It doesn't mean it's inaccurate. It's just a little stale because they're often 20, 30, 40 years old in some cases. Often communities don't have the wherewithal, or we don't have the budget to give a community a grant to update their entire comprehensive plan. So it's like Jackson County only is going to do this element. So some of the elements are more up to date than others, but there's a lot of really good information in those comprehensive plans, even though some of it is a little stale. But the biggest piece is that they provide the factual basis for your decision making and for the zoning code, which we'll get into in a little bit here. Well, next slide. It's providing the factual basis for a lot of your code. It also provides, the bigger picture stuff, your goals and your policies, kind of your vision, so to speak, as well as a lot of good maps. So your zoning code, those are the things that you all interface with the most, right? So these are the things that are designed to implement the comprehensive plan, right? So these are things that address uses and heights and densities, setbacks. There's criteria that set out. They set out, what needs to happen in certain cases. It sets out the process for the permitting, what level, type of permit things are, so it provides all the details. And it's really set up to implement your comprehensive plan, which is meant to implement the statewide planning program. Oh, I got this nice and individual bullets here. Okay, so let's get into the types of decisions. So as alluded to earlier, there are legislative land use decisions. So these are decisions where you're updating your zoning code, you're updating your comprehensive plan. These are things, those are just examples, but it's like kind of things that are touching on bigger picture things like policy or bigger document kind of changes. They usually will affect a large geographic area, including many ownerships, and that's one of the distinctions between that and a quasi-judicial decision, which we'll get into. No decision is required for a legislative the proposal. So that doesn't mean that if the board puts something forward that they don't want you to make a decision, but you all have to just recognize you don't need to make one in that type of case. And I've seen it in Jackson County and other places where individual property owners will come to the county asking them to make legislative changes to their code for various reasons. And you can entertain that, and the board can entertain it. You don't need to do it. It's different than a quasi-judicial decision, which we'll get into, which you're required to actually respond to and make a decision in a timely manner.
At that point, would it be appropriate then to refer them to their representation, right? To their senator or?
Well,
we can't, obviously, we can't make code decisions or change that. But we just say, hey, thanks for the info. Next.
We do sometimes. The most recent one I can think of that got some attention was the ADU update to the LDO. And so typically those would be initiated by the board. And then they would send it to staff who would draft, proposed amendments to the LDO. And it would make its way up to the planning commission, who would conduct a public hearing, and then that would be recommended to the board to adopt formally.
Gotcha.
And so, like, it could, if it was a proposed legislation for a state statute, then that would go through the state reps probably. But in certain cases, the county does modify its LDO and make other changes.
Oh, that helps, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I'd add is, if there's a, property owner or a developer or, somebody coming in and saying, hey, I'd like you to make these changes to your code, if it's something that violates state law, then you would want to say, you basically say that's not allowed by the state. You need a legislative change to implement that, in which case they need to talk to somebody at the legislature. If it's something that's allowed by state law, like the ADU thing, for instance, that was legislation that was passed that allowed ADUs on certain rural residential properties, but it was optional for communities. So if a property owner said, said, hey, why don't you guys implement this, then it would be something that the board would be able to make a decision on as to whether to initiate that with you all and with the planning staff.
Thank you.
With legislative land use decisions, basically you're the decision makers. You're not the decision makers on legislative matters. You're going to be making recommendations to the board, but the board basically sits as decision makers. They're lawmakers in that case. They're changing the law based on that legislative proposal. With that, there's fewer procedural restrictions that apply, and there are things that don't apply, like ex parte contact, which we'll talk about in a little bit of detail later. But ex parte contact's allowed for legislative land use decisions, and that's basically just talking to people, going out, if it's the board or planning commission, going out and talking to people about what they think about this new proposal. That's something that's allowed. So quasi-judicial decisions are a different story. So basically, what you're doing here, and you guys are making most of the decisions are at the planning commission level, right? Are there some type level permits that they only make the recommendation to the board?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So okay.
With the exception of subdivisions.
Okay. Most of them are actually going to the board, so you're making a recommendation. Okay.
Mostly legislative.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's a little different in different jurisdictions, but you're basically sitting kind of as an impartial tribunal when it comes to these kind of things. So it's a much clearer kind of defined process for your quasi-judicial land use decision. So you've got pre-existing criteria that are established in your code that are outlined that require discretion, or else they wouldn't be coming to you. So and a couple more distinctions. One is that usually it's quasi-judicial decisions are affecting only one property or maybe a couple properties, but a small geographic area. Action is required, like I said, and we'll get into the timeframes a little bit later. And let's see, I'm getting into some of this stuff about impartiality, but it requires treating all people fairly, like, all parties fairly, which we talked about. And we'll get into some more of the details here about disclosing ex parte contact and using factual information to support your decisions. Okay, and then the things you guys don't see, and many of you are well aware of, are the ministerial actions. These are things that don't require an exercise of discretion, like a building permit, for instance, right? So if you as a property owner come into the counter, or as a developer come in and you want to build a home on a lot and it's an allowed use, you go there, you submit your building permit. There's the planner's not saying no, you need to go, there's no discretion. It's very simple. You're not seeing these kind of things, but that is the third level of decision, of the type of decision. So you've got the legislative, quasi-judicial, and then ministerial. With legislative hearings, all people have the opportunity to participate. So people can come in. It's not people that are only affected by the decision. Anybody can come in and voice their opinion on it. And there are no concerns, like I suggested earlier, and we'll define ex parte contact bias and conflict of interest a little bit later, but there's no concerns with ex parte contact when it comes to legislative decisions, but conflict of interest is still a concern that remains, and we'll get into the details a little bit later. Quasi-judicial application. So what happens before something comes to you? You guys probably know this, but some things require a pre-application meeting. Not all of them, but some of them. So the Planning Commission has had opportunity to kind of vet it with the property owner or the applicant a little bit to say, yeah, we think this is going to work. You should submit an application, or you need to really do a much better job justifying this, or this is the type of information you need to submit. So that kind of stuff happens behind the scenes often. And then when an application's submitted, the department reviews the application for completeness. They have a certain amount of time to review an application, and they either accept it as complete, or they write a letter indicating that it's incomplete and the information that they need to be able to deem it complete. So for the notice of quasi-judicials, who gets that notice? So the applicant gets the notice, adjacent property owner, so that the 100, 250 to 500 depends on whether you're in a city, in the UGB, or outside of a UGB. Any recognized neighborhood association. Do you guys have many here?
I don't know of any.
Josephine County has a ton, but you guys, yeah, they have quite a few. And then if you have any other local requirements as far as noticing. These are things, and we don't need to go through all this. These are all the things that are required as part of your notice. Yeah, we don't need to go into that. You guys use a script? You guys have a script to use? Okay. So that's great. And I've actually given your script out to other small jurisdictions with your permission because it's really super helpful, to be able to know how to conduct a hearing, right? It's not something not many of us were raised in a setting. Some of us maybe, but not all of us were raised in a setting where, we're privy to these kind of formal hearings, right? So, these are the types of things, and we won't go over them since you guys use a script. Same thing here. We don't really need to spend much time going over this, except, and I'm not sure if you guys are privy to this, but if somebody requests a continuance, you need to grant a continuance for 7 days. So it's a requirement to be able to do that. Often, what happens, I don't know if that's on the next slide. Oh, it's a little bit later. You'll break it up in a little bit of a different way to give different folks different opportunity to testify or to present their information. But before we get into that, I want to just go into some hearing tips. So, and sometimes it's glossed over because, especially in Jackson County, when the staff does such a good job like laying out the staff report, it's easy for the Planning Commission to just kind of like gloss it over. But it's really important to at least lay out the nature of the application. You read the title, right, and that's great. That's usually enough. But if you read it ahead of time and it's not enough, you can ask staff for a little bit more, or get it from their staff report a little bit more to tell the public who isn't privy to all the the nomenclature and jargon what actually is being proposed, right? And we'll get into details again. I keep saying this, but you want to poll your commission for any bias or conflict of interest or ex parte contact, and then you're going to go through the hearing process. And I don't know if it's the same in Jackson County as many places, but often the council especially doesn't want you to deliberate unless there's a motion on the table. Are you guys pretty strict about that, or is it pretty open? I mean, sometimes they'll just close, the commissioner or the board will close the hearing, and then they'll chit chat a little bit without putting a motion on the table.
Working on that.
Okay. I mean, and I don't know
We're doing our best to
I don't
not
know
do that.
legally if there's necessarily a problem. It's just you don't want to get too far down the road without putting a motion on the
I
table.
prefer to have a motion on the table.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. That's the safe route, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
We probably do a fair amount of deliberation before motions.
I would prefer to have a motion on the table.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's the general recommendation, is just to be safe that way. Yeah. because I've seen it go on for too long without that. Definitely. You guys all know this, but with quasi-judicial, well, maybe you know this, hopefully you know this, but with quasi-judicial applications, there is a clock that's ticking. Outside of urban growth boundaries, it's 150 days. That's what you're dealing with. So basically, you are required to process a quasi-judicial application within 150 days after it was deemed complete. Extensions can be granted up to, I believe, up to a year. But it has to be, and basically the applicant needs to agree to that. Sometimes they will, sometimes they want to force a decision. If you don't process it in the 120 or 150 days, then the applicant can file what's called a writ of mandamus, which basically just it shifts the decision making from your purview to the circuit court, and the circuit court basically makes a decision on your behalf. Something that most jurisdictions want to avoid, because circuit court, you know, in the state of Oregon, we have the Land Use Board of Appeals, right? It's unique. We've got a board that really just hears land use matters, and it's important because land use matters are complicated, and it takes a certain amount of knowledge and background to understand all the case law when it comes to land use decisions. The circuit court, they're dealing with a whole bunch of stuff. So land use isn't their specialty like the Land Use Board of Appeals. So really, it's in the jurisdiction's best interest to not have it go there. So, but it's something to keep in mind when you're processing these, and that's kind of getting back to the thoroughness versus efficiency kind of debate. Especially with quasi-judicial applications, you want to make sure that you're moving through the process, not getting bogged down too much.
The other reason we try to avoid it is we've had one writ filed in how long have I been here? Almost 9 years. And it essentially resulted in a 2-day trial. And we had to expend a lot of resources just to deal with it. And so it's not the most efficient use of our tax dollars.
Thank you for that. That's the stuff I don't know about. I don't see that part. I just get to read the case afterward. So one of the main things that you all do, right, and make decisions, and you and staff, I know, provides you with a very thorough staff report, including findings. But what you want to do is make sure you review those and make sure you agree with them, right? And make sure that they're addressing all of the relevant facts. They're walking through the different approval criterion. And that you are relying on the facts to make your decision. So it's kind of making sure that the story is tied together, right? So that your decision isn't completely separated from the findings on the ground. We don't need to get into the other piece. I kind of talked about that. Some tips. So, and a lot of this is going to be on staff because they're the ones that are presenting it, but identify all the applicable criteria. Sometimes they're lumped together just from an efficiency standpoint, but it's really advisable to kind of keep them separate. You know, you don't want to be called out on something was glossed over. You know, if something goes to court, you want to make sure that you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's. State what fact led to your conclusion, and especially when there's inconsistent evidence. So sometimes you'll have two neighbors saying two different things, or sometimes you'll have two professionals submitting reports that say two different things. Your job in that case is to explain which one you agree with as a commission and why. So, and the court, and I'll defer to counsel on this, but the court will often provide deference to the local jurisdiction, to the commissioner, to the board on that, as long as they've stated that clearly why you decided to go with that one, this piece of evidence over this other piece. And then you want to, a lot of your decisions have conditions of approval. So with that, you want to make sure you articulate the link between the project impact and that condition that's being imposed on the project, because often with contentious things, there are going to be times where an applicant is not happy with the conditions that are imposed. It's too severe. You're asking for too much. So you want to, especially in times like that, want to be clear about, well, the impact is X, and our code says this, and this triggered this, so that's why we're imposing that condition. Common problems with findings, like I said earlier, the failure to address each criterion, lumping them together. It's easy to do. You're writing a staff report or as a commission. It's a lot of work to kind of walk through all of them, but sometimes it's necessary to kind of just break them out, or at least to have staff to break them out in their staff report. One of the other things is deferring a necessary finding to a condition of approval. That's basically establishing a condition of approval to meet a finding. And that's okay as long as you make the case that it's reasonable that condition can be met. So you basically, I used to call this is kind of a backdoor denial. So you don't agree with the project, so you condition it in a way that it's never going to be able to be accomplished. That essentially is not what you should be doing. You should be denying the project in that case. You shouldn't be setting them up with conditions that are not even possible to accomplish. Generalizing, making a conclusion without sufficient facts. I've kind of touched on that. And then establishing that causal relationship between facts and conclusions. That's really just telling the story, especially for the audience. Explaining why, providing the rationale for why you made a certain decision. The burden of proof's on the applicant. So that's at the end of the day, it's the applicant's responsibility to make sure that they've submitted a complete application with all the necessary material. They've addressed the criteria that have been established as applicable, and addressed any issues that are raised by folks. And then, let's see, if someone brings up new information, you need to give a chance to rebut that, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. And then the last piece is you can't use matters that are not part of the approval criteria to approve or deny an application. So, and that's often the trick with getting public testimony, is that folks often don't speak to criteria. They speak from passion, from the heart, right? Like, I know this is going to, I don't want this to happen. And it's your job to discern that from the criteria and to remind folks that your decision is based on the criteria. And you can't use that heartfelt emotion, even though maybe you want to make a decision if it's not supported by the criteria. So this is touching a little bit more on the opportunity to keep the record open. So if somebody asks for a continuance the first time, it needs to be granted. Typically that's open for 7 days, and you can chime in anytime here. One scenario we often see is the 777 rule. So you open it up for 7 days so anybody can submit new information, including the applicant. The next 7 days is for rebuttal by any party to any of that new information. And then the last 7 days is specific to 7 days only for the applicant to rebut any of that information. So it's kind of giving them the last chance to kind of close the loop there. Raise it or waive it. You guys probably know this. Okay, getting some nods. But basically, if somebody doesn't bring up an issue before during the local proceedings, they can't bring it up when it comes to LUBA. So often what you'll see is, especially sophisticated folks, just put out a whole list of things, and some of those are valid, some aren't. But it's because they won't have that opportunity to bring that up later, so it preserves that opportunity for them from a legal standpoint. All right, so when you're processing quasi-judicial applications, you're acting as an impartial tribunal. You need to be free of personal bias and interest. So some of the things that determine whether you're impartial is the ex parte conflict, or ex parte contact, the conflict of interest and bias. So we'll get into each one of those. So ex parte contact is contact by a party on a fact at issue, so something that you all are hearing, under circumstances which do not involve all parties to the proceeding. So, somebody in the public got notice of a land use hearing that's coming up before you all, and they see you at the grocery store on Saturday in the morning, and they want to let you know how they feel about it, right? And your first instinct is probably going to be, hey, hold off. I don't. Why don't you come to the hearing? They say, oh, I work. I don't have all the time in the world. I'm just going to tell you how I feel. And sometimes you can't stop that, right? It's a small community. So it's going to happen. So then what do you do, right? So how do you handle it? So the first thing is you have to disclose that on the record. So when you guys have your script, one of the things you do is ask whether anyone's had ex parte contact or conflict. So it's your job as a commissioner to say, actually, I had a conversation about this at the grocery store, and this person, you don't even need to provide a name, I don't think, but you just say, this person told me X, Y, and Z and how they felt about it. It didn't affect my decision or whatever, but it's basically just an acknowledgement that you had some conversation about it. So you just want to make sure that that is noted in the public hearing log. And then you technically are supposed to provide opportunity for the public to ask questions about it. That's an example where no one's going to probably speak up about it, but there could be circumstances where there might be some comment about it from the public, and that you have to offer that opportunity for them to talk about it. Site visits are considered ex parte contact, so it's good if you disclose them. And this isn't something that everyone does. I know a lot of small communities, they're like, well, it's a small town. I was in Gold Hill last year or something, and they're like, I walked by that. They were having a decision on this property, and they literally walk by it from their house to their, walk by it every day. I need to disclose that, and you're like, yeah, technically you're supposed to. I mean, it's a little absurd in that case, but you really want to just be able to state, if you go out to a property, and it's, you're going to want to do that often in some cases, like there's a contentious hearing on an item and it's about slopes or something, and you want to go out and see, are the slopes really as steep as they are saying or whatever? So you go out there, and basically what you want to do is just explain. You want to open up, say, I went out to the site and here's what I saw, or I did X, Y, and Z, or the property owner came out and actually talked to me a little bit, and here's what we talked about. Just to be able to make sure everybody has all the information that you have. If you noticed there's a flat spot where they want to build their house, and that was the only flat spot in the whole property, that's the kind of stuff you want to say. So conflict of interest is basically two categories: a real conflict of interest, an actual, or a potential. So potential conflict of interest is any decision by a person acting as a public official, which you are, which could be to the private financial benefit or detriment to you, a relative, a member of your household, or a business with which you or one of those folks is associated. So if it's not clear that there's actual financial benefit to your person or to these people, you can continue to participate, but you want to declare that. So same type of thing. You want to go on record and say, my cousin Joe, blah, 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 just explain the situation ahead of time so everybody knows, because what you don't want to have happen is for someone to hear about it and come to the public hearing and say, oh, your cousin, you can't make a decision on this. You want to be upfront, forthright about it, so you put that all out there. Basically just said that. Well, I did say you can participate in the hearing. If you have a full quorum of your planning commission and your vote isn't needed for a quorum, you can decide to still recuse yourself even though you don't think it's necessary, and that's mostly just an appearance thing. Some things are very clear. It's like that obviously isn't going to matter, but then sometimes it's like in the gray area, so if it's in a gray area and your decision isn't necessary because there's enough of the rest of the commission to make a decision, you can recuse yourself in that case. Oh, and then the last piece is, if there's more than one hearing on it, state this every time. So that's the ex parte conflict, the conflict. So state it every time. It's a little, it's extra work, but it's worth it. So the actual conflict of interest differs from the perceived or potential in that there would be financial benefit to you, a relative, a member of your household, or a business with which one of you is associated. In that case, you must not participate in the hearing. So you disclose it. I have a 50% stake in this property, and even though I didn't submit the application, obviously I'm going to be, benefiting from it. So you step down. We recommend when you step down that you actually leave the hearing room. It's a little awkward, but I don't know if you guys provide any advice on that. It's just a little awkward for you guys to take your hat off there and then go sit in the audience with a different hat on. It's not, I don't know how big of a deal it is as long as you don't get up and testify. That could get very weird very quick. But if you just go there, sit, I don't know if it's a problem, but we recommend you just actually leave, and then someone will tell you when the next item comes up. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one.
I don't think I have different advice. I mean, I think legally you could testify as a member of the public. You'd have the same rights as anybody else, but you wouldn't be able to participate in deliberations or in the decision.
Yep, and I've seen it done, and it's awkward. So if that's the case and you have like an interest in something, usually what you would do is have somebody else testify, So anyway, but it has happened. So there is an exception to the actual conflict of interest, and this has to do if you have to recuse yourself, if there aren't enough votes on the remainder of the commission, you actually are then required to make a vote. To the extent you can avoid this, I highly recommend it. So basically, you call up you get the planning staff to call up the other commissioners and say, hey, can you zoom in for that 15 minutes even though you're on vacation because we need your vote, or whatever it is to make that happen. But there have been circumstances where, and sometimes, you guys know this, there's a vacancy on the planning commission and you just don't have enough people. So you need everyone to vote. And that's kind of like a circumstance like this where you've declared an actual conflict of interest, but you need to vote because they don't have a quorum otherwise. In that case, you don't participate in any of the deliberations whatsoever. You only cast your vote. It's very complicated from a legal standpoint afterward. So
That's what I was going to ask. Does that open it up for lawsuit later, or for like an appeal?
definitely.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
If that happens, my advice would be to grant a continuance if you can. I mean, and just try to figure out a way to get a quorum otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, really, I think it's probably only going to happen if you are 2 people short on your planning commission or something and you haven't been able to fill those vacancies and there's a quasi-judicial hearing that's before you with the clock that's ticking and you need to make a decision. And anyway, so just be cautious. Hopefully that never happens. So bias is when one cannot render a fair judgment in a matter because of an acquaintance or relationship with someone or something in a land use case. And it differs between conflict because there's no financial, component to it, but it's a relationship or something that may hinder you from making a rational decision. These aren't as clear necessarily always, but essentially I'll forget if I did that in the next slide. So what you want to do in this case is you want to disclose that like anything. And then you want to state very clearly whether you feel that bias or that relationship should disqualify you. So whether it actually created a bias for you or not. So there's a lot of gray area with that, and it's an appearance thing once again. So if you feel like if it's too gray, you should probably recuse yourself. But if you feel confident about it that you can still render a decision without any bias, then you can do that as long as you state that. And that's it. So these are some resources that you guys may or may not be aware of. We got a planning commissioner handbook, guide for public officials, and then also putting a people in planning document. They're all, some of them, they're not old, but they're a little old, but they're still relevant.
Email these to us?
Yeah, I can do that. And then there's my info in case you need me. All right. Yeah, you're welcome. You guys have any questions? All right.
Did a great job.
Yeah, thanks. All right.
Normally there would be.
And some discussion.
I was thinking the same thing when I saw it.
Do we have anything coming up?
The proposed meeting on the 28th has been canceled, so we have nothing on the books at this time.
Was that our joint?
No, that was going to be, yeah, LDO updates.
Oh, okay.
For the update.
No, this is something, we have a BRIC grant, and so we've asked them to look at specific things for emergency management type, not emergency management, but like wildfire hazard and building code. And so they've done some of the audit, but we haven't had a chance to review it with them.
Okay. Sounds good, I think.
So nothing on the books.
Not at the moment. Okay. Well, then with that, we'll adjourn. Thanks, everybody.